The cadets stood at attention, their sleek uniforms a sharp contrast to the gritty environment of the medical chamber. Their eyes were wide with disbelief as they watched the human on the table, his body torn and battered from the brutal fight. Their advanced technology had never encountered anything like this. No species ever had. They had been trained for this moment, prepared for the sight of a human in such a state. But nothing had prepared them for what came next. The human, despite the severity of his injuries, didn't scream or panic. Instead, he simply sat up. The cadets froze, unsure of what they were witnessing. There was no fainting, no outburst of pain. The human's eyes locked onto theirs, and with a weary but defiant grin, he muttered, "I'm fine." The cadets exchanged nervous glances. They had seen alien races withstand injury, sure, but never in their training had they encountered a species so resilient. The human's body, which should have been lying in a crumpled heap from the damage it had taken, seemed to be healing on its own. His skin, bloodied and torn moments ago, was knitting back together. This wasn't just a matter of advanced medical technology, it was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't have been possible. One cadet, unable to hold back, stepped forward. How are you doing this?" he asked, his voice laced with a mix of awe and fear. The human didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood, brushing off the remnants of the battle. His movements were slow but deliberate, as if the pain was merely an inconvenience he had grown accustomed to. And then, with a half-smile, he said, "It's just what we do. You see, we don't break that easily." A shiver ran down the cadets' spines. This wasn't just a simple fight for survival. This was something far deeper, far more unsettling. How could one species endure what no other could? How could they withstand pain, injury, and adversity with such defiance? The cadets had been trained to conquer, to dominate, and yet here they were, unsure how to respond to this unexpected resilience. As the cadets circled the human, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, one of them spoke up. "But you're still a human. You should have been gone by now." The human's eyes flickered with something close to amusement. "You've got a lot to learn about us," he said. His tone was calm, almost too calm, considering the circumstances. "Trust me, this isn't the first time I've been through something like this." The cadets found themselves on edge, a sense of unease growing within them. What had they just witnessed? And more importantly, what did it mean for them? They had expected a quick end to the conflict, an easy victory over a fragile species. But instead, they had met something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Suddenly, the room's lights flickered, and a loud alarm blared through the facility. The cadets turned in unison, their weapons instantly at the ready. The human didn't flinch, only raised an eyebrow as if he knew exactly what was coming next. Outside the chamber, a new threat loomed, one that even the cadets hadn't prepared for. And the human, the one they thought they had defeated, wasn't about to back down. The cadets instinctively raised their weapons, their eyes scanning the darkened hallways through the reinforced glass of the medical chamber. Something was wrong. The alarm, blaring throughout the facility, sent a ripple of anxiety through the ranks. The air in the room had shifted, thick with the realization that they were no longer the predators, they were on unfamiliar ground. Outside the chamber, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed. It wasn't the typical patrol unit they had expected to hear, nor was it the sound of their ship's automated systems running checks. These steps were too deliberate, too human. A chill ran down their spines as they realized what was happening. The human they had just treated like a specimen was no longer the weakest one in the room. The human, still standing nonchalantly in the center of the room, turned his head slowly toward the door. His expression was unreadable, though a trace of something darker lingered behind his eyes. The cadets had no idea what they were dealing with. In their minds, the human was an anomaly, something they could study, contain, and ultimately understand. But this was different. "You're not just a regular human, are you?" one of the cadets asked, his voice tight. He couldn't help but stare at the figure in front of him, no longer sure whether this was a man or something far beyond their comprehension. The question hung in the air like an accusation, but the human simply shrugged. "Does it really matter?" he replied, his tone as casual as if they were discussing the weather. "You'll find out soon enough. But you might not like what you learn." The lights above flickered again, and the rumbling sound of distant explosions vibrated through the walls. Something was happening on the other side of the compound, something far worse than the cadets had ever been trained to confront. The human wasn't just a survivor, he was becoming something else entirely, something they weren't prepared for. The cadet who had asked the question, his face now pale, stepped back as he realized they were no longer in control. "What's happening?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. He had heard whispers of human capabilities, rumors of their tenacity, their ability to endure beyond reason, but he had never believed it could be true. This was a level of resilience that went beyond physical strength. It was something deeper, more primal. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, and the medical room's glass began to tremble with the force of whatever was approaching. The cadets' fingers twitched nervously on the triggers of their weapons, but they didn't fire. They couldn't. The human hadn't done anything to provoke them, at least, not in the way they understood. But they weren't sure how to handle him now. He wasn't acting like a prisoner. He was acting like a force of nature. "Do you think you're the first ones to come after us?" the human said suddenly, his voice colder now, slicing through the tension in the air. "You're not. You're just the next in a long line." The cadets were taken aback by the sudden change in his demeanor. It was as if a mask had slipped, revealing something beneath a layer of steel and grit that wasn't supposed to be present in a human. The atmosphere was electric now, the tension palpable. And then, without warning, the door to the chamber slammed open with a deafening crack. The cadets spun. The first of the enemy had breached the facility. A massive figure, armored in black and gleaming under the lights, stepped into the doorway. His eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. This wasn't a normal soldier. This was something far worse. The human standing before them didn't flinch. In fact, he seemed almost eager, his stance shifting like a predator preparing to pounce. "Guess it's showtime," he muttered, and for a moment, the cadets saw something they hadn't expected. A flicker of fear. The massive figure in the doorway took a slow, deliberate step forward, his armored boots echoing through the medical chamber. The cadets raised their weapons instinctively, but there was a palpable uncertainty in their movements. The human hadn't reacted the way they expected. He wasn't the broken specimen they thought he would be, and now, as the towering figure moved into the room, the cadets realized they had miscalculated on multiple fronts. The human didn't flinch, didn't even blink as the armored figure stepped closer. Instead, he studied him with cold, calculating eyes. "So, you're the one who's been causing all the noise, huh?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else in the room. His voice was rough, tinged with the strain of whatever ordeal he had just endured, but there was something else beneath it. Something unsettlingly calm. The cadets didn't know how to react. They had trained for combat with alien races, with enemies who possessed superior technology and strength. But this human, this anomaly in their carefully constructed world, had shown them that their training had prepared them for everything. Except him. He had survived things that would have shattered the strongest of their kind. And now, it seemed, he was the only thing standing between them and whatever this new threat was. One of the cadets, his fingers still clutching his weapon, took a hesitant step forward. "What do you mean, causing all the noise?" he asked, his voice shaky. He wasn't sure what he was afraid of: the human, or the massive figure looming behind him, or the growing feeling that they were all in over their heads. The human glanced at him, the faintest hint of a grin crossing his face. "You'll see. Trust me." The tension was thick, suffocating. Every cadet felt the weight of it. The once powerful beings who had traveled to this planet with the expectation of conquering, of demonstrating their superiority, were now faced with a mystery they couldn't solve. Their weapons, their technology, their training, none of it seemed to matter against the human standing in front of them. The massive figure in the doorway took another step, his armor glinting as he moved, and the cadets braced for an assault. But instead of charging forward, he stopped. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying the human who had dared to defy their expectations. The air seemed to crackle with the promise of violence. "Why aren't you afraid?" One of the cadets finally asked, the question hanging heavy in the room. The human didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the window, peering out at the dark expanse beyond. The stars glowed coldly in the distance, and the cadets could feel a sense of unease creeping over them. It was as if they were no longer looking at the universe through a lens of superiority, but as mere spectators. "You should be afraid," the human said quietly, turning to face them, his voice now low and steady. "The real threat is out there, and it's coming for all of us." The cadets exchanged uneasy glances. "What do you mean?" The same cadet asked, his voice barely a whisper now. The human's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the room seemed to darken, as if the very air itself was growing heavier. "You're not the only ones who've been watching," he said. "There's a reason I survived, a reason they haven't been able to break me. And if you think this guy," he gestured toward the massive figure in the doorway, "is bad, just wait. You haven't seen anything yet." The armored figure finally stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. A strange hum filled the air as his armor seemed to shimmer and shift. For the first time, the cadets realized that it wasn't just his size that made him terrifying, it was the overwhelming presence he carried with him. Whatever he wasn't just a soldier. He was something else entirely. And then, without warning, the lights in the room flickered once again, plunging them into darkness. The hum of the figure's armor was the only sound left in the room, and it felt like a warning, like the calm before an even greater storm. The human's voice cut through the silence, its harshness sharper than before. "The real fight is just beginning. And you're about to find out what happens when humanity isn't your weakest link." The cadets stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. They had come here with a mission, but now they were faced with something they couldn't explain, something that threatened to unravel everything they thought they knew about the universe. And as the darkness seemed to grow thicker around them, they realized that whatever came next, it would be nothing like they had prepared for. The darkness swallowed the room, but the oppressive silence didn't last long. The low hum of the massive figure's armor reverberated through the chamber, vibrating the floor beneath the cadets' feet. The lights flickered, then blinked back on, revealing a scene that was even more unsettling than before. The human didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the armored figure, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his stance that sent a chill down the cadets' spines. He was no longer just a survivor. He was something different, something more. The cadets' weapons felt like toys in their hands now, their training seeming useless against the palpable tension that had gripped the room. They had always been the ones in control until now. Now they were waiting for something they couldn't anticipate. Their breaths grew shallow, each of them instinctively aware that the next moments would decide everything. The human had already shown he was not to be underestimated, but the armored figure, the presence that filled the room with a weight they couldn't place, was just as dangerous. And now they were caught between the two. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the energy of what was to come. The figure moved again, this time without hesitation. His armor shifted, and the sound of metal scraping against metal filled the room, almost like a growl of some dark, lurking animal. The cadets tensed, but it wasn't the figure that made them pause, it was the human. He hadn't so much as flinched. He stood as still as ever, but the look in his eyes said it all. He was preparing for something far beyond their comprehension. "Stay back," one of the cadets said, his voice strained. His hand shook slightly as he kept his weapon trained on the human, but his eyes were on the figure in the doorway. The armor-clad giant was taking one slow, deliberate step after another, each movement a promise of destruction. The human, almost lazily, turned to face the cadet who spoke. "You don't understand," he said flatly. "If you don't let me handle this, none of you are going to make it out of here." His voice wasn't a command, but a fact. And the way he said it made the cadet hesitate, his finger frozen on the trigger. Suddenly, a loud, sharp crash echoed through the room as a piece of the ceiling above them collapsed, sending debris scattering across the floor. The cadets instinctively scrambled for cover, their instincts kicking in, but they couldn't help but glance back at the human. He hadn't moved. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene with eerie calmness. The armored figure, now nearly at the center of the room, reached up and unclipped a massive weapon from his back. The cadets had seen weapons like this before, built for devastation, for overwhelming force. But this wasn't just any weapon. This one seemed to hum with an energy that made the walls themselves seem to pulse in rhythm. "Move!" a cadet shouted, aiming his weapon at the human, but the order was pointless. The human wasn't listening. In fact, he didn't even look at them. His attention was fixed solely on the towering figure, a low chuckle escaping his lips as he stepped forward, meeting the figure's gaze for the first time. "This is what you came for, isn't it?" the human said, his voice colder than before. His posture shifted, muscles rippling beneath his torn clothing as he prepared himself for whatever was coming next. The cadets backed away, their weapons still raised but their confidence faltering. They weren't sure what was happening anymore. They had known the human was strong, but this was something different. They hadn't trained for a fight like this. The tension in the air became almost unbearable. The figure's weapon crackled, energy sparking across the chamber, filling the space with an unnatural light. The cadets braced themselves, knowing they were about to witness a battle that could change everything. The human's lips curled into a grim smile. "I'm done running," he muttered, the words barely audible. Then, with a speed that no one expected, he lunged at the figure, his movements sharp and precise, like a coiled spring snapping into motion. The cadets watched in stunned silence as the two figures collided in a blur of motion. Sparks flew. The floor beneath them trembled with each impact. But just as quickly as it began, the struggle paused. The figure and the human stood locked, their forms grinding against each other in a battle of sheer will. The cadets watched, frozen, as the room seemed to close in on them. And then, a deafening roar tore through the silence. The armored figure threw the human back, sending him crashing into the wall. The ground shook beneath their feet as the figure raised his weapon again, his eyes glowing brighter now. It was clear the final clash was coming. The cadets had no idea how it would end, but they knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The room was heavy with the aftermath of the brutal collision. The human lay motionless for a brief moment, his body crumpled against the cracked wall, but then, with a harsh groan, he pushed himself to his feet. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes still burned with a fire that seemed impossible to extinguish. He didn't flinch, didn't look at the cadets or the figure standing before him. All that mattered was the challenge. The armored figure took another step forward, the hum of his weapon louder now, the energy surrounding it crackling as if eager for destruction. His massive frame loomed over the human, but there was a hesitation now, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Something had shifted. The confidence the cadets had seen in the figure was faltering, and for the first time, they weren't sure who was in control of the situation. The human wiped the blood from his brow, a thin smile forming on his lips. "You still don't get it, do you?" he muttered, barely a whisper. His voice was hoarse, but it carried an undeniable weight. The cadets watched in stunned silence, each of them trying to process what they were witnessing. The human wasn't just surviving, he was pushing back, challenging the very limits of what they thought possible. And then, in an instant, the battle between the two figures erupted once more. But this time, there was something different in the air. The energy, the tension, it was building towards something much bigger. The human's movements were faster, sharper, and the cadets couldn't deny it anymore. They had underestimated him, and now they were seeing a side of humanity that no one had ever anticipated. With a fluid, almost graceful motion, the human ducked under the armored figure's massive strike and slammed his fist into the figure's chest. The sound of metal crumpling echoed through the room, and for the briefest moment, the figure faltered. It was a crack in the facade of invincibility. The cadets, who'd been watching from the sidelines, were no longer spectators. They were part of the unfolding reality, part of the chaos that was spinning out of control. The human had done something no one thought possible. He had broken through the figure's defenses. It wasn't just strength that had gotten him this far, it was something else. Determination, willpower, a refusal to be defeated. The massive armored figure stumbled backward, its weapon now vibrating in its grip. But instead of attacking again, it paused, a strange sound emanating from within its armor, almost like a sigh of recognition. The cadets stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Had the human won? Or was this just another moment before the real fight began? The human stood tall, his chest heaving with exertion, but his voice was steady as he addressed the figure. "It's over," he said, his words cold but final. "You've lost." The armored figure stared at him for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, it lowered its weapon. The tension in the room shattered in that instant, as if a storm had passed and the calm had returned. The cadets exhaled in collective relief, their weapons still trained on the human but no longer with the same sense of fear. They realized that what they had witnessed wasn't just a fight, it was a lesson. The human had not only defeated the impossible, he had proven something deeper. Humanity was more than just flesh and blood. It was the will to survive, to fight against insurmountable odds. And in that moment, the cadets, once so sure of their superiority, knew that they would never look at humanity the same way again. The human turned to face them, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. "If you're ever planning on invading Earth," he said, his voice now filled with quiet confidence, "you'd better think twice." With that, the tension in the room finally dissipated. They had come here to conquer, to show their dominance, but in the end, it was humanity that had shown them what true strength really was. As the human walked away, disappearing into the shadow of the room, the cadets were left to reflect. They had learned something they hadn't expected. They had learned that no matter the odds, no matter the force they faced, there was always something more powerful than just raw strength. It was the human spirit, and it was far from being conquered.